What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 81, and I am the host, Kyle Lanslone. Connor Freeman, a writer at the Libertarian Institute and a frequent guest on the show, is returning today to talk about the situation going on in Yemen and then the diplomatic issues with Iran as Biden is floundering his opportunity to give back within the Iran nuclear deal. So we have a really interesting conversation about that. Help the show, support the show. You could donate, Patreon, Subscribestar, or the links to the Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash wallets are in the show notes pages. You could subscribe to the show at YouTube, Library, Odyssey. It's published at the Libertarian Institute and is also on all the podcast feeds. Wherever you listen, like the show, make sure you do what you can to put out there to more people in your social media feeds or just by recommending it. Anything you could do to help the show to grow would be really appreciated. Me and Will are working hard to put out clips and a bunch of content from the show on all of our social media platforms, whether that's MeWe, Facebook, or Twitter. So check out the accounts there, whichever one you prefer to use. And make sure you hit the share button on our stuff. The last way you can support the show is by supporting the sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you go to get your CBD products. The products are great for helping like mental health, anxiety relief, or physical pain, back pain, shoulder pain, whatever you got going on. They sell a bunch of different products, soft gels, extracts, gummies, topical skin creams. Some of the extracts have extras like melatonin to help you get to sleep. I really like the topicals that help to relieve pain. Will Porter, the co-host, is a fan of the CBD with melatonin for insomnia. Whatever you got going on, check out PalomaVerdeStore.com. They have a great education tab there, so you can figure out how CBD could help you out personally. And they have their lab results also up there, so you know that you're getting quality products that are the same every time. No more head shop gummy worms. Again, PalomaVerdeStore.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, for a 25% discount when you spend $75 or more. Now let's get into the interview with Connor. What's going on, Connor? Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Kyle, for having me on. What's up?
Not too much. Really looking forward to the show. We have planned a lot on Yemen and Iran. For people who don't remember Connor, he's been on quite a few shows lately, but he's a writer for us at the Libertarian Institute, and want to mention that thanks to the support from, I'm sure, a lot of listeners of this show and a lot of other people, we hit our winter fundraising goal at the Institute, raised like over $50,000 in just a couple weeks. So really appreciate everybody giving to that. It's definitely going to go to put out more great work by myself, Connor, and then the rest of the guys over there, Scott Pequinonez, Sheldon Richmond, Keith Knight, Pat McFarlane, Will Porter, and others. So Connor, again, thank you so much for all the writing that you've been doing at the Institute, and I'm sure you'll have some articles up soon for us to discuss, but we just got a bunch of news stories to talk about today. A lot of important stuff on Yemen is where we are going to start. So there's a battle going on right now in central Yemen for the city of Mareb that's racking up quite a high death toll. The city is held by the Saudi-backed government, and the Houthis are attempting to take it. It seems like a fairly ruthless battle with a lot of shelling going on, and that there is some civilians in this area. So I'm sure it's only adding to the misery and death toll of Yemen. For those watching the show right now, you can see a map, and Mareb is kind of right there where the blue, which is the Saudi-backed government, meets the red of the Houthis. And the Houthis are trying to push westward and take it. It would be, I guess, a significant city for the Houthis to take because of some resources in the area, and it would largely then mean that the Houthis are holding the territory that was up until like 1990 historically North Yemen, and so that could create either interesting bargaining chips or boundaries for a new state. Along with that battle going on in Mareb, there's also kind of an air and missile battle going on right now between the Houthis and Saudis as well. In this past week, I guess the Houthis were able to launch a drone and missile strike and hit some Saudi um, oil targets. Now, the Saudis report that nobody was killed in these attacks, and it doesn't look like it was anything near on the scale of what happened, I believe, what was that, in September of 2019, where a significant number of the Saudi oil production was actually shut off by the attack that was allegedly launched by the Houthis from Yemen that hit the Saudi oil refineries. But these repeated attacks by the Houthis, which are having some success and, of course, are in response to the Saudi war against the Houthis, has, according to U.S. officials, raised a lot of alarm, is what they say. And they're concerned about the frequency of the attacks, and they say that they're genuine security threats to Saudi Arabia. This is really important, Connor, I think, because the Biden administration, their position on Yemen is that they're only going to help Saudis with defensive issues. And so the Houthis are presenting what they say are genuine security threats to Saudi Arabia. Then that seems to be a green light to do just about anything they want as far as waging war in Yemen. So, those are some of the things that I've noticed in recent days. Of course, I'm sure we'll get more into especially how this has all been covered, where anytime the Houthis, retaliate against Saudi Arabia, that's something that the U.S. has to be concerned about. That's something that we have to respond to. But when the Saudis are bombing Yemeni cities, and, you're going to talk pretty soon here about the humanitarian situation causing this absolute crisis, there's no, we need to respond to this, we need to hold the Saudis accountable or anything. So, Connor, go ahead and
Right.
pick up from there.
Well, I'll say to begin, absolutely. I think so. We had Biden come out at the sort of, I guess, what was it? It would have been early February, come out and announce that they were rescinding support for, quote, offensive operations against Yemen, offensive Saudi operations, and they were going to stop the relevant arms sales and only really help Saudi Arabia defend itself from threats. Who they usually tie to Iran. Blinken's been doing a lot of that lately, conflating the Houthis with Iran. But in response to this, so there's this battle going on, as you discussed, in Marib province, and so what's interesting is the Houthis have proposed essentially that they would stop sending their drones and their ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia at their oil facilities and military sites if the Saudis would stop bombing Yemen. And
Connor,
so the Saudis have.
do you know the last time the Houthis reiterated that offer? I know they have said that throughout the Trump administration and even in the Biden
Yeah.
administration that, they would stop the missile attacks once the attacks on Yemen stop, and they've never stopped. So the missile attacks have never stopped. That's made sense. There have, I think, been like month or two long kind of successful pauses where the Saudis weren't carrying out at least as many airstrikes and the Houthis weren't carrying out missile strikes. But when was the last time the Houthis made that offer?
Well, I've got a report here from yesterday,
Okay.
from Dave Decamp, who says in February the Houthis offered to halt drone and missile attacks inside Saudi Arabia in exchange for an end to Saudi airstrikes. But as he said, they continue to support Houthis forces with air power. So the Houthis are essentially retaliating. I mean, there's been quite a few, like scores of Houthi fighters have been killed in these battles. And so what's happened then in response is we have the embassy from Saudi Arabia saying our support for Saudi Arabia is unwavering. The U.S. embassy condemns the recent Houthi attacks on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we have Jen Psaki, the press secretary, saying we will look for ways to improve support for Saudi's ability to defend its territory against threats. And I know Blinken has been coming out after he sanctioned the Houthi leaders and essentially saying that Iran is getting all tied up in this. He goes, Iran's involvement in Yemen fans the flames of conflict, threatening greater escalation, miscalculation, and regional instability. He said Iranian weapons are used by the Houthis to conduct attacks threatening civilian targets and infrastructure in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And it was also ironic to hear the Saudis come out and say that they bomb because they bombed Sana'a recently, and they said they were doing it in response to well, when they did it, they said. Especially referencing the attacks on like the Aramco sites, they go attacks on civilians. I'm paraphrasing, but they're basically like attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are a red line for us. And it's like, for 6 years, the Saudis with the U.S. and the UAE have been committing a genocide targeting specifically civilian infrastructure. I mean, everything from weddings to hospitals to roads to bridges to schools to cholera treatment centers during the pandemic. It's just been,
School buses and
relentless.
funerals intentionally targeted.
Exactly.
They blew up a school bus full of children. I think killed 40 plus kids. I've seen a number range from like 40 to 50 children murdered in that attack. And the school bus was in the middle of a market too, so there were other casualties as well as the children. Not that that really makes it any better, but they said that the school bus was carrying weapons. So even then, you think you then carry out the attack not in a crowded area. But nope, they really don't care at all about minimizing civilian casualties. There's video of them bombing a funeral hall, and you could see them people, who are, I'm assuming, grieving from the funeral, fleeing the building as more Saudi planes come and blow them to pieces. I mean, the video's there. To condemn the Houthis for attacking Saudi oil infrastructure while ignoring all the crimes of Saudi Arabia is absolutely ridiculous.
Oh yeah, and then of course we're back to the usual sort of whitewashing what the Saudis do as defense in this proxy war they're engaged in with Iran, and of course we know they're under blockade. We were discussing earlier. There's questions about how much U.S. support is involved with the blockade at this point. It's still quite murky. I think we would both say, I mean, obviously that's an offensive operation. I think that qualifies, starving a civilian population, full blockade on all air, land, and seaports at this point. On the 25th, it'll be 6 years since U.S. support for the Saudis war started. So we've seen them, go after water. They bomb waterworks and sewage facilities in order to cause all kinds of diseases and preventable diseases like cholera. I was just reading, actually, I've got some notes one of the things I noticed, one of the things I was reading from, there's an article that Mark Lowcock, who's the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, put out a piece with The Guardian talking about the humanitarian situation with these diplomats and humanitarian officials from Switzerland and Sweden who just collaborated on this basically a pledging conference to this March 1st to raise money for the AIDS situation there in Yemen. And I've got bad news. So last year, there was a shortfall of $1 billion, and they only raised half of what they had pledged in 2019. Lowcock and these other experts were saying that so some of the figures say 3.8 billion, but in Lowcock's article, he says that they were shooting for $4 billion to support the dire situation there to remedy it. And actually, they came up way worse this year. So they were only able to raise, I think it's like $1.7 billion. Let me double check that. But they came up $2 billion short, ultimately. And
yeah, and I know in the past that a lot of the pledges have come from the countries that are like enforcing the starvation of Yemen, whether that's the U.S., Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or the UK. And actually, I was talking about in the last show, and I think I still have an article here, where the UK was actually going to cut in half. Yeah, they were going to cut in half their aid to Yemen in 2021. So this doesn't look like a problem that'll be resolved, even if even if they do make up the, I guess, deficit from last year or something like that, because the UK is cutting their aid, and they're one of the major, participants in this war, certainly profiting off of it. One of the countries that are refusing to stop selling offensive weapons, whatever the hell that actually means, to the Saudis.
Right. The U.S. I believe contributed 191 million dollars to the situation, and with all the money that we spend on the empire every year, more than $1 trillion. I think we could all agree. I'd like to see some money pulled out of the Pentagon and then put into this into Yemen, because and lift the blockade, of course. But these people are. I mean, so listen to what I couldn't believe some of these stats. You've got 5 million people are on the edge of starvation. 2/3 of the population requires humanitarian aid. 16 million the UN says are malnourished. Almost 50,000 are living in famine-like conditions. And with the aid cuts, what we've seen is now 6 million people, including 3 million children, are without clean water and sanitation services. We've had water networks shut down or scaled back. There's 15 major cities with who only have half of their normal water supplies. And across the country, people are struggling to obtain water. And of course, we know, like, with the Saudi strategy sort of emulating what the U.S. did to Iraq in the 90s, they've targeted, like I said earlier, sewage and water so that it becomes impossible, especially under the blockade, to obtain clean water. So you drink water because you don't want to die of you don't want to dehydrate to death, but the water you're drinking is what's giving you these diseases. And so every 10 minutes, at least one child in Yemen dies of diphtheria or cholera or measles. It's just absolutely unbelievable. And I think most people who listen to the show will be familiar, but it bears repeating. You've got 2.3 million children who are expected to go hungry this year in Yemen, and 400,000 are expected to die of acute malnutrition if the situation is not improved. And it needs to be improved fast. And like I said, this does not bode well, this current situation with respect to the aid. Half of all children under 5 are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition. So I don't know. I mean, the thing is if they're going to try and make basically they're trying to, I guess one of the arguments is that the Houthis need to stop. The Houthis need to agree to a ceasefire, and then we'll sort of work on peace and lifting the blockade and these sorts of things. But as Daniel Larison points out in his piece, he quotes an author who was saying, no, the two situations need to be decoupled immediately. We should lift the blockade. It should be unconditional. I mean, this is like, I mean, it's said often, but like I said, I mean, this is genocidal. You're starving children, men, and women to death. No, I mean, and also if the Saudis are going to continue to bomb Yemen and we're not going to lift the blockade, why should the Houthis agree to a ceasefire?
Right.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense.
I think that's a really important point that most Americans miss, is that the blockade or sanctions are, offensive economic war against a country. And so you got people in a situation like, the people of Yemen or the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, who are under siege conditions, who are, starving to death. They don't have enough for their children. They don't have enough medical supplies. I mean, the UN said this last year, Gaza would be unlivable, and still there's 2 million people, suffering and struggling and trying to live there. And then anytime they do anything in any kind of retaliation, so, one person in Gaza who is called Hamas fires off a rocket, then Israel gets to bomb them in defense, and yet they limit the amount of calories the Palestinians could have. And so when you inflict those kind of conditions on people, anything they do really can't be considered offensive, because if you're starving them to death, anything they do to fight back is I say defense, you know what I mean? Not that I want Saudi citizens to be the target of Houthi missiles or anything like that, but at some point, you just can't let a more powerful power continue to inflict pain and suffering on your population, and saying that we're going to engage them at the negotiating table when, as you point out, the Houthis already put out and suggested that they would, be willing to go along with the ceasefire thing, but at the same, no airstrikes, no rocket attacks, but at the same time, to cut off all offensive for the Houthis isn't a ceasefire, because the blockade is still being actively enforced, and that's an active aggression. So that's a really great point, Connor. It just how all this is the Houthis and the Yemeni people are, again, the people in Palestine, having to act out of the desperation of the situation inflicted upon them, by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia or whoever.
Yeah, the U.S. empire is fond of making these proclamations and judgments that are just absurd. I mean, in the 1990s, when Iraq was under blockade and the global embargo, and the U.S. and the United Kingdom and France were doing their no-fly zone bombings. They claimed that the attempted radar locks on the planes were acts of aggression, and no Allied planes were ever hit the entire more than a decade that Iraq was being bombed. But it was still called aggression. I mean, Ron Paul even talks about this in his books, where he's like, but we were told no. In fact, the Saddam did aggress against us. He tried to shoot down our airplanes. It's like, well, what were they doing? They were bombing Iraq. As we know, Jeremy Scales pointed out, 3 to 4 times a week. And of course, but I guess, I don't know, if they say the right country, Iraq, Iran, whatever rogue state du jour is, we're pummeling and attacking, then, they assume that that's good enough PR. If you can say they're a threat to our allies, whether it's Israel or Saudi Arabia, then it's kind of accepted. I will just say, I was going through this Save the Children article, and there's some very good, well, not very good, but very concerning quotes, I would say. So this says, Muhammad, they're talking about how essentially the food assistance has been halved, and because of the aid cuts, all the restrictions on basic necessities that people can obtain. So it says, Mohammed Nasser, a father of 4 living in a camp for internally displaced people near Sana'a, said, I have been receiving a monthly food basket, which played a major role in covering our food needs. Since April, we started to receive 1 basket every 2 months. I don't know why our rations were halved. We skip meals to make sure that my children don't go to sleep hungry. And then it says, because of the cuts, water networks have begun shutting down or scaling back, with 15 major cities, like I said, reporting that they can only receive half of their normal water supplies. Yemeni people are struggling to obtain water. It says Yahya Mohammed Baluch is one of hundreds of thousands taking shelter from the fighting in the Abs district. There was no water in his camp until the nearby well was repaired through an aid project, reaching almost 500 families. But 250,000 people in Abs still don't have clean water. He says, an aid worker said, we meet people who are drinking contaminated water or spending money on water when they can barely get enough to eat. And I also, there's another Aziza, a 38-year-old mother of 10 from Hodeidah Governorate, one of the areas hardest hit, said, since the conflict escalated in Hodeidah, I wake up every morning wondering how and what to feed my children. My husband is a casual laborer, and he mostly can't find any work or money to provide for us. The last 6 months were very peaceful for my family. We received a monthly cash transfer, which allowed us to buy enough food for the entire month. I was able to provide or prepare nutritious meals for my children for the first time. The cash helped us survive during the most difficult time of COVID and the conflict. I wonder how we will manage to live when the project ends. And so it's just, I don't know. I mean, they were looking for nearly, $3.8 to $4 billion. They've got 1.7. And I don't know. I mean, I like I said, I haven't heard anything that the U.S. is planning on contributing more. They're just attacking and basically, it's just more of this stuff about how Saudi Arabia is the victim in all this, really.
Right. And I guess the unfortunate thing is, even if the U.S. were to give more, that's only a very, very insufficient band aid to actually ending our support for that conflict. And,
Yeah.
that would include, and, stop enforcing the blockade. And, aid ships should be able to dock at the port of Hadeda. One of the important things to point out is that, Yemen was a really poor country before this conflict happened. But before this conflict happened, the port of Hadeda was up and running. There were the kind of permanent big cranes that could really offload these massive cargo ships quickly. Saudi Arabia bombed those. The U.S. then,
Right.
I think, donated like 4 mobile cranes, which aren't as efficient, but at the same time are better than nothing. And apparently, Saudi Arabia like held up those even getting into Yemen for 2 years. And so they're clearly not trying to let aid into this country where it's desperately needed. So, look, if you don't have clean water, chlorine tablets are a solution to make sure that you don't dehydrate to death and that you don't then get cholera or whatever waterborne viral bacterial thing that makes you have diarrhea and vomit till you die, right? Like these are very simple solutions. That's why this, whether it was all cholera or not, was like the worst waterborne epidemic caused in modern history. They say the cholera
Yeah,
epidemic or
millions
whatever
of
it was.
cases.
Yeah, millions of cases. This doesn't happen because all you need are chlorine tablets to prevent this. And yet if the aid ships could come in like they should, they would have those, but they don't. And so yeah, unless there's a real change. Aid funding is great, but we also need to be able to get the aid into Yemen, and that's been really blocked.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Before the war began, 90% of their food was imported, and like you said, it is actually the poorest country in the Middle East. So it's just been, I mean, they knew. I think like what they said in that New York Times piece, that where they infamously said that we're doing this to placate the Saudis because of the Iran deal. They said the war will be long, bloody, and indecisive. They essentially knew that this was gonna happen, but I guess it's part of the policy. My suggestion, I wrote a piece on this last month, and my suggestions for how what the U.S. should do is, I say we should end all arms sales to the Saudis and the UAE, have the U.S. military promptly discontinue the coalition's blockade, like any and all support, and lift all sanctions, and totally cease intelligence sharing with the Saudis. All logistical, we have cut logistical assistance, um, at least ostensibly, but I mean that could include. I mean, there's so many caveats with that defensive qualification that it's hard to say. But I would say we should also get all the U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia. I know CENTCOM is discussing building more bases in Saudi Arabia for contingency plans for conflict with Iran, um, and out of range of their missiles and this sort of thing. And we've got, I mean, in the buildup under Trump toward the end of his administration, that maximum pressure campaign, we sent a new fighter plane squadron to Saudi Arabia, and I think 2,000 troops.
Patriot
And
missile
yeah, you
batteries,
just got.
which are, so if one of the things that could possibly force Saudi Arabia to the table to end the war would be the Houthi missile strikes starting to deal some real damage or something like that. If the U.S. were to withdraw its troops from Saudi Arabia and the Patriot missile batteries, I would assume that would really hamper Saudi's ability to deflect those missiles. And so now you're going from a situation where the past 5 years, other than the Aramco attack, I can't really think of many other examples where the Houthis were able to inflict much damage. I think at one point they killed a bunch of Qatari soldiers, but I think they were actually inside of Yemen when they hit them with that missile. They damaged a couple of ships in the Red Sea. They again, like, recently they've hit like the airport in Riyadh. They've hit a couple other targets, but they haven't been able to inflict any real damage on the Saudi state. And so, look, when you're at a war, when your opponent can't possibly hurt you, you could put your hand on their head and they can't reach you with their arms, then you could sit there and beat them up all you want and really not have to deal with it. So if the U.S. does things like even withdraw all of our support from Saudi so they don't have the intelligence and stuff, I think it'll really force them to the table.
Yeah, and they can, like I was saying, you can drive a truck through that, because that whole uh, qualification about defensive, because like if it, yeah, they're going to provide, you have to, that's the other thing too, is we don't know if they're providing intelligence for the blockade as well.
Right.
You know, I
Yeah.
mean, they could be basically like, I mean, if they're I mean, they're a satellite. So the U.S., it's been, experts have agreed that the U.S., if they want to shut this war down, they can. That's been the consensus for years. And like I said, I mean, we just said, laid out a few things that the U.S. could do. But of course, instead of that, we have, I don't even, I mean, I'm not, this is largely looking to me like it's mostly been, I don't want to say all rhetorical, but I mean, it's possible that, sort of like with the refueling situation, where Saudi had the capability to basically, they had acquired the stuff they needed from Boeing to conduct their own refueling missions, that they no longer needed U.S. support, and it was becoming so unpopular at that point that it made sense to kind of end that program. But you know, I mean, the U.S. I mean,
No, I think
Saudi
that's
can
a really
essentially,
good example that you just made there. That the U.S. is removing an acceptable amount of support that Saudi Arabia doesn't necessarily need at this point because they've advanced their own capabilities somewhat, and the UK is still selling them offensive weapons, and we're still going to sell them defensive weapons. And McKenzie, General CENTCOM leader McKenzie, said we're still going to provide them with like defensive intelligence and stuff like that. It seems like it may not just be rhetorical, but at this point, it's a half step out of the war when it's not really, when Saudi depends on the U.S. a little bit less for those kind of things. So we're not removing the kind of, necessary support that Saudi Arabia needs to wage this war. We're just removing a little bit of the extra stuff that, look, hell, they've had 5 years to do it. And also, you just mentioned that placate Saudi Arabia quote there. One of the things that Joe Biden, of all people, and the people in his administration like Sam Power, Ben Rhodes, and others, Wendy Sherman, Blinken, Sullivan, they should know that the exchange was that we're signing the Iran nuclear deal and we're going to allow Saudi Arabia to wage this war in Yemen. And so if they're not even going to bother to get back into the nuclear deal, and we can move on and start talking about Iran a little bit next, why the hell are we still waging this war in Yemen? There's no reason to placate the Saudis anymore. It's
yeah.
crazy. Anything else on
No, yeah,
Yemen
and
before we move on to Iran?
I think we mostly covered it. But yeah, no, it's just yeah, no, I've just, like I said, I think we mostly covered it. It's just an absolutely horrible situation. You've got these people are essentially still completely under siege, and they're being bombed. Civilians are still being bombed. Sana's being bombed. So no, there needs to be unrelenting pressure from activists in all the different countries, where, including especially America, who are supporting the Saudis and their coalition the most.
All right, so there's this great article by Mads Blumenthal on Richard Nephew, who I had not heard of till I read this article, but is apparently going to be a very important person, and has been in government, actually. The title of the article is Biden Iran Envoy Boasted of Depriving Civilians of Food, Driving Up Iranian Inequality, and Sadistic Sanctions Manual. Richard Nephew will take the position here of Deputy Iran Envoy, and boy, does this guy have a history, Connor. Matt's has some excellent quotes here from it. Well, not excellent as in good, but excellent as in very revealing quotes from his book, which he titled The Art of Sanctions, A View from the Field. And in the book, he kind of explains what the point of sanctions are and what they're supposed to do. So do you want to get into some of the really, really disturbing quotes that Nephew says in his book?
Yeah, so he's the Biden's making him the deputy Iran envoy, and he was formerly the principal deputy coordinator of sanctions policy for Obama's State Department. And if once we'll get into the quotes, this is almost reminding me of bringing Bolton to the table in meetings with the North Koreans. It just seems like, or appointing Victoria Nuland to that number 3 spot in the State Department. It's an act of aggression in and of itself. I mean, this guy, essentially, I mean, his book is called The Art of Sanctions. So he looks at this like it, he's being so creative, and it's, I look at how, brilliant it was of me to come up with this. But he's talking about, attacking manufacturing industries and the automobile industry and making it difficult for for Iranians to obtain the parts they need to fix their cars. He's talking about increasing, basically, he says that the idea is you need to really attack like the social fabric of these targeted countries and attack their resolve politically, socially, and really go after essentially, even he talks about how the Iranians were making some economic new economic they're implementing economic policies that were supposed to increase the purchasing power of Iranians, and he talks about how they purposely would set up a situation with the economic with their sanctions and their economic warfare strategy to ensure that only people in sort of the elite, like the well-connected and the wealthy and connected with the government, would be able to benefit from those policies. And he talks about how they were trying to
Wait, can
drive
we?
up
I want to hit
unemployment.
on that
Oh,
one
please.
part a little bit more, because what you're saying, so the narrative on U.S. sanctions is always they're there to target the people who are doing the damage to the people, right? So the sanctions are there to help the Iranian people at the expense of the Ayatollah. And you're saying the exact opposite was the purpose of those sanctions. They were making it so it looked bad for the government, right? They wanted to look like the Ayatollah is
Exactly.
corrupt. And so they were making sure that the people suffered and that the Ayatollah and his government got rich. It's
Exactly.
absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes sense. He goes, as it says, Max says, as he made clear, the rising inequality the quote is, was a choice that Washington made on the basis of helping to drive up the pressure on the Iranian economy from internal sources. He went on to claim credit for protests in October of 2012 brought on by the devaluation of Iran's currency. And I thought this was very interesting. He goes, in a fairly stunning admission, Nephew admits at one point that despite providing Iran with supposed humanitarian exceptions on U.S. sanctions, the economic war he helped design caused a catastrophic shortage of medicine and medical devices, largely because Iranians could not afford them. He goes on to pridefully describe how he helped engineer the tripling of the price of chicken during the Iranian holiday seasons. And he goes, we contributed more to popular frustration in one bank shot than years of financial restrictions. Um, yeah, it's he goes, we targeted Iranian manufacturing jobs and export revenue. They really went after, beginning in 2012, oil exports and the as they basically, I mean, he goes, once we got the value of the currency to basically just completely spiral downward, he called it a tremendous success. It's unbelievable.
Right. Well,
The guy seems like he really enjoys this. In fact, he's got a quote here from him where he goes to Moscow, and he lamented that food was still plentiful in the capital city, because he's like, well, the sanction, it's really, we need to be doing more if we want to really put more pressure on them.
right. I mean, I
Like,
guess, it's kind of like the nuclear planners, right? Where, like, once it's your job to, like, come up with how many times we're going to bomb Moscow and how many Chinese people, like, is an appropriate retaliation if, like, the Chinese take Taiwan or something like that. This guy is just, kind of a sick person who somehow has it in his head that the regime in Iran and Moscow need to be overthrown. And one of the ways that he could help facilitate that is by making the people of those countries suffer in such a way that they direct all their hatred not at the U.S. that is causing their additional suffering with the sanctions, but rather at the government of those countries. It's just an ultimate cruelty, and I mean, you have to think an awful lot of yourself to be willing to do that to people, I guess. This guy must just be another one of those government sociopaths. I was recently talking about on a show, Connor, about the Michigan, Department of Natural Resources found some lady who was taking care of some sick animals, and she didn't have the proper permit. So to save the wildlife, they killed the animals. It's just this kind
It
of
was yeah, that was horrific.
right. It's this
They
kind of sit
what was it?
backwards
There was
thing, right?
a deer that was euthanized in front of, or at least on the premises of the farm. It's just
Yeah.
it's this. You're right. It's absolutely it's this callous kind of banality of evil thing that's going on. Sort of like how someone could go out there and sincerely like we were talking about with Jen Psaki, how, or it was just coming out, we condemn the Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia, and we will work to boost their defenses. It's just, I guess some people have found really what their calling is in life when they do these sorts of things. Because if you can really separate yourself from that, from the moral weight of, like the guy's saying, like, triple increasing the prices of food so that it's not obtainable by average people just to put pressure on a government whose internal policies you don't like, or their foreign policies. And it's not even like, it's like recently Biden just extended that executive order from the Clinton era that it put sanctions on their petroleum exports, and he put out a statement where Biden goes, they're a threat. Iran is a critical threat to our foreign policy. It's kind of the same thing they say about China, where they're like, China is a threat to the international system, the way we like it. You're going for full spectrum dominance and primacy, and these unabsorbed countries that are not threatening America. They're not threatening American citizens. They're threatening the American order, the established order. And so they're willing to, sanctions is a favorite weapon we've seen with Trump and with Biden.
Yeah.
They're refusing to lift these sanctions. There were 800 imposed on Iran by the Biden administration, 800, I think, added by the Trump administration. Biden hasn't lifted any of them.
Yeah.
And they're not planning on doing it. It's part of a strategy to coerce concessions from Iran. And basically, I guess, it's for months before even Biden was elected, Jake Sullivan was talking about how basically they're going to use the Trump sanctions to gain leverage for basically, particularly with their missile. They want to get them into talks with Saudi Arabia and Israel. We've been hearing talk from different Biden appointees or officials in the administration who say that they're consulting. They want to consult Israel and Saudi Arabia about these issues. And of course, it's all these. Iran has said that they'll get involved in regional talks, but they don't want it to be stage managed by the U.S. Government. And look, if we want to get back into the deal, if we want Iran to cease the uranium enrichment and reduce their stockpile of enriched uranium up to 20%, which they're using for these negotiations, as they have previously, then sanctions are not the way to do it. That's how they're mistaking. They think that guys like Nephew, that essentially the U.S. brought Iran to the table with the sanctions program. But the truth is Iran brought the U.S. to the table because they started this program of enriching uranium in late 2011. The negotiations didn't really start till 2012. And what they did was they doubled the centrifuges that were capable of producing or of enriching uranium to 20%. They, I believe, built up a stockpile of like 280 kilograms of uranium enriched to 20%. And they started, using it. They weren't storing it for a bomb. They, I think, shifted. Gareth Porter has an article about this. He talks about how they took, I think, 40% of it and used it to fuel their reactor. But this is how they brought.
They were selling
it
too. Until the U.S. actually sanctioned Iran, so they can't export their enriched uranium. This was one of the really interesting things that happened under Trump, is that they were claiming that, oh, one of the key parts of the Iran nuclear deal was Iran's cap on the amount of enriched uranium they could hold, and the Trump administration sanctioned Iran from exporting the enriched uranium, so they were forced to break that cap because of the sanctions applied on them, and so that's just how far and silly that these sanctions have gone. But I think you make a really important point there with more people like Nephew in the administration. I think you put Wendy Sherman in this position as well. She's the Deputy Secretary of
Sure.
State. A recent interview between Scott Horton and Peter Van Buren, actually, who is a former State Department employee who's a part of the Iraq reconstruction effort, wrote "We Meant Well." He explains that actually the Deputy Secretary of State could even be even more important because typically the Secretary of State will lead up the main goal of the Biden administration. So if it's, let's say, better relations with Israel or better relations with NATO countries, that's what Blinken will be doing. But Wendy Sherman will be managing Yemen and Iran and everything else. And these people, and she said that even if we got back in the JCPOA, we wouldn't remove all sanctions from Iran. So it looks bad on getting back into it, and looks like all the people in the Biden administration learned the wrong lesson from the first round of negotiations that successfully led to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and they're about to essentially blow a free victory. Donald Trump got out of this deal. The Iranians are willing to get back into it, and they're not willing to do it. It's a mystery as to why, other than even when this was originally passed, like Chuck Schumer voted against it. I think Bob Menendez has announced that he's wants more things to be included, so he's a poison pill kind of guy. I'm guessing Joe Manchin isn't going to be for it, so maybe they're worried about politics and stuff like that. But we're talking about lives here. We're talking about trying to bring some semblance of stability to the Middle East by being able to end at least one U.S. economic war, and it doesn't look like the Biden administration is going to take that very easy victory.
No, and then they're actually mimicking the Trump administration quite a bit. I mean, we've saw just, I guess, I think over the weekend, B-52s were flown into the Persian Gulf, accompanied by military aircraft from Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
And
And what makes
Israel.
it different this time? Yeah, exactly. They were guided by Israeli F-15s through Israeli airspace. And they were all these aircraft were photographed together. A major escalation. It's like, I mean, Israel does not want us to re-enter the deal. That's been made clear. We've had all kinds of escalations. I mean, you've got Israel bombed Damascus just last month and killed 9 people. They're accusing Iran of the explosion on that Israeli-owned cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman, which of course hasn't been proven. That they're saying that there was a Libyan flag tanker that left Iran and went to Israel, and then they say it purposely dumped oil. It's, by the way, Israel is not what's the environmental protection minister, who's a member of the Likud party, is making these accusations. They're not supported by the military and the intelligence community in Israel. However, I don't think Netanyahu has yet made a call on that oil spill, if he has said anything about her accusations. And there was reports from Business Insider, for instance, that said that Biden officials and European officials are concerned that Israel may be gearing up for some sort of substantial attack. We have Benny Gantz, the defense minister, telling Fox News that Israel is upgrading their plans to attack Iran. They're saying that if necessary, they'll act independently. And of course, he's talking about, he says that, the usual bit about how they're racing toward a bomb. And as Dave Decamp points out, they're referencing, what we've been talking about, the increased enrichment to 20% for the Tehran Medical Research Reactor, and also, as we were saying, for leverage in talks. And if he was sincerely concerned about that, then he would be encouraging Biden to return to the deal. But of course, that is not what's happening. And in fact, they have this working group that's led by Jake Sullivan and I'm blanking on his name. Meir Ben Shabbat, who's essentially his counterpart in Israel, the national security advisor, and they're communicating that they let Israel know about Biden's bombing of Abu Kamal recently before it happened through the working group. Israel said they were very happy about that. Basically, I believe their foreign minister, I forget his first name, but his last name is Ashkenazi. He was saying, they have a great relationship with the Biden administration, and that Gantz and Netanyahu are working with the Biden administration in a non-oppositional manner. We're treating them as allies and making sure that we maintain constant conversation and communication over the Iran file. And I mean, they already announced that essentially basically any decision that's made on Iran policy will go through Israel will be consulted first. So
Right.
it's not really, I mean, Trump's policy with respect to his deference to Israel made a mockery of the whole America First, slogan, but there's not even a pretense of that now. And I'm not, obviously Israel and Saudi Arabia are satellites, but as we can see, there's such an institutional interest here. And I think truly, if you look at Saudi and Israel's interests, a lot of their antagonism toward Iran, I don't think Israel actually necessarily wants a war with Iran. I think they like having Iran as the big boogeyman that they can point to distract from their occupations of Palestine, and also to keep, as it goes back to the dual containment policy, to maintain their relationship with the U.S., where they can basically count on unconditional support and military aid and diplomatic support, and they don't have to worry about the U.S. And of course, Saudi Arabia is concerned about this too, bringing Iran back into the U.S. orbit ever at any point. And so, largely, the last few decades have been about ensuring that does not happen, and successive administrations have played into it for
Yeah.
their own interests too, of course.
Right. I would imagine President Connor Freeman would get up there and would say that the Iran nuclear deal made sure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, and should they decide to announce that they were doing that, the IAEA would be able to give every country well over a year's heads up that they were trying to make a nuclear weapon. And we think that this is a really great deal for our friends in Israel, who constantly whine about how concerned they are about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And so we're getting back into this thing, not because we're concerned about Iran getting a nuclear weapon, but to help bring stability to the region because Israel is so concerned about it. And just made some kind of statement like that that's just like
Yeah,
Israel
yeah.
has
We
to
want to
eat
keep
it.
Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia safe.
Mm-hmm.
We're just concerned about the Israelis. We know that Iran, Israel keeps saying that Iran wants to wipe them off the map, and we're very concerned. We're taking this very seriously, so we want to make sure that the program is safeguarded as it has been. And yeah, I mean, it's like on its face when you put it like that, it makes it so blatantly obvious that has nothing to do with what's going on here. They want there's other agendas afoot. It
Right.
has nothing to do with Iran, and of course, Iran isn't seeking a nuclear weapon. They may, if we continue to do this if we continue to antagonize them in this way and encircle them, like what Trump was doing. I wouldn't be surprised if we start hearing about, like we were in the last few months, we were talking about in the show, how Trump had aircraft carriers and the Israelis had their nuclear subs in the Persian Gulf, and just the F-16s that were moved from that base in Germany to the UAE. And of course, we were talking about the buildup in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I know that there have been fatwas going back to the Iran-Iraq war from both from Ayatollah Khomeini, and then carried on ever since by Ayatollah Khamenei, that they believe it's essentially verboten, it's against their religion, and they won't do it. They won't build chemical weapons either, even if the U.S. is supplying them to Saddam to use against conscripts and killing tens of thousands of people in the field with sarin and taboon. And they didn't do it. But the thing is as we've discussed before, I mean, Elijah Magnier has said that if pushed into a corner, they'll go to full nuclear capacity, and that's just a part of being, fully capable, is the ability to make a bomb. They don't necessarily need to make one, but it's, I mean, as President Connor Freeman, I would support Iran. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but the thing I'm least afraid of is states like North Korea having nuclear weapons. I'm really not. They're not. I think it's only for deterrent. I mean, it's for deterrence. The U.S. has used nuclear weapons. I'm more concerned about the U.S. starting a war with China, and there being a nuclear war. Or, because of all the provocations or all the escalations that have been taking place in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. That's way more concerning to me than Iran being able to defend itself and being able to stand up for itself instead of having to basically live under these sanctions. I know you discussed recently on a show that Javad Zarif said these sanctions have taken $1 trillion out of their economy. It's heinous. America would nuke another country that sanctioned $1 trillion, that imposed sanctions of that level. And like you said, it may be I mean, maybe it's not exactly $1 trillion, but we were just discussing. I mean, look what they've done to that country.
Right. Like, it's one of those things where I talked about this with Yemen, and I think it's easier to understand there. Where even if, like, you completely turned off the war tomorrow, like, children are going to starve to death from the war just because the roads, the bridges have been destroyed, the fuel's not there, the hospitals have been destroyed. And so it's going to take time to rebuild the infrastructure, to rebuild the sewer systems, the water wards. Martha Mooney's explained they're waging a food war. So, you got to rebuild the farms. They bombed the cereal plants. You got to, restock the flocks of sheep that they bombed and all that other crazy stuff. Well, in Iran, the economy has been completely turned upside down again. You can't rely on essentially any outside goods. So, like, imagine like pharmaceuticals. All of Iranian pharmaceuticals had to be produced in Iran because if sanctions come down again, you can't lose those, right? And so, like, you had to completely structure the economy differently. We've targeted the construction sector quite a bit, and so I'm sure that there's projects that would have been built had the sanctions not come in place that are either set back years or will never be built, and you'll never make up that economic loss. Not to mention the lost opportunities from this generation of Iranians who are now probably bitter and poor, and but whenever you don't have a job, life sucks, and despair causes suicides and stuff like all that stuff is going on in Iran in part because of U.S. sanctions. So.
Yeah, and that we were talking about that executive order from the Clinton era that was just re-implemented. Biden said he's going to keep. It was supposed to expire this year. I want to say might have been here. Let me see.
I think it was coming up in
Anyway,
March, like March 14th or
March,
21st
right?
or something. Yeah, it was in the next few weeks.
Yeah, so I mean, he's leaving it on for another year. You've got Kamala Harris on the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu saying, unwavering support, no questions asked. We condemn the International Criminal Court for even investigating war crimes in the occupied territories, and she reiterated that they are committed to working with Israel on the Iran, what did they say? The Iran's, combating Iran on their nuclear program and their malign regional activities.
Yeah.
So, and Biden is saying that, I want her to take the initiative and really do more of these calls with world leaders because I may decide to not be president at some point. So, I mean, just the fact that she's making those calls and going out there and putting out those statements, that doesn't bode well to me because they're looking forward with Kamala. And I think Kamala is probably because Biden has the legacy of Obama that he feels like he has to, I think he's been rolled and I don't really trust him, but I think the optics of him being against the Iran deal, even ostensibly, didn't they're going about it in a different way. I'm not saying he necessarily wants to get back into the deal. I mean, the evidence bears out that they don't, but he still said that they did. I don't think Kamala Harris is going to have a problem saying no way.
Yeah, I think that Biden at least feels like he knows more about foreign policy than Kamala Harris, which is my understanding. Part of the reason why Biden's having Kamala take this call is because she has like no foreign policy record or experience at all. And so, honestly, I now feel like I really have to start looking at who Kamala Harris's foreign policy advisors are, if she's going to
Yeah.
be taking point on some of these things, because there is, separate like advisor positions from like the National Security Council specifically for the vice president. And while those positions probably typically aren't important at all, they seem to be important here. The other thing with Biden is I always, I guess, have this like hope that because he personally suffered a loss from war with his son Beau, that there is at least a realized cost in his case. And where Kamala, I'm guessing, is still a lot more theoretical from her and her people from the Rand Corporation and from CNAS and from all the other, PNAC and all the other think tanks are probably like, see, no, this is the way you say people. This is humanitarian interventionism, responsibility to protect. Miss Vice President, you absolutely have to do this for the Saudis, the Israelis, or whoever else. Our people are going to suffer and die. And knowing nothing is just going to say, whatever you say. Connor, what else do you have before we wrap up here, though?
Oh yeah, sure. We'll get into some of the escalations with China and Russia, but I'll just say really quickly that Kamala Harris is a Russia hawk, and in fact, she even went on that show with Charlemagne the God on Sirius, and it's actually the same show where Biden said that if you're voting for Trump, then you ain't black, or I'm paraphrasing,
Right.
but on the same show, she went on there and she was talking about. She goes, "Remember this quote? If you watch it, like we joked about Saturday Night Live being a joke. They couldn't have possibly written something this good." She goes, "Remember the heat, the controversy over the whole Colin Kaepernick thing." She goes, "Well, very smart people have said that it really wasn't a thing. The Russian bots got in on that." And then she just sort of raises her eyebrows at the hosts of the show, like, you know what I'm saying? And they go, "Do you think the Russian bots are tracking your campaign?" She goes, "Oh, we know they are." So she's so off on her own trip there with whatever think tanks are in her ear that she doesn't even care to pretend to be, supportive of, Colin Kaepernick, for God's sake. It's just, she all that or support. It's all the Russian bots,
She always
right out of
biases
Hillary's
Russia.
playbook.
Yeah, no, it's concerning that that's her. Like even on something like that she would default, where it would seem like it's a real easy thing for her just to support Colin Kaepernick and Black Lives Matter. She goes right to, oh, it was the Russians behind it, and so yeah, if she believes that kind of hysteria on Russia, who knows what she'll believe. That's real concerning.
Yeah, no hesitation. And she's been going to there's been that she's been Israeli partisan for quite a while as well too. I mean, there's nothing good about Kamala Harris. Like at least Biden said some things about Mohammed bin Salman that he's not following through on, but like he might have even trapped himself rhetorically into some of these policies that we agree could obviously be improved, like Yemen, for example. But I mean, he has called Saudi Arabia a pariah nation, or not the government. He's called them a pariah state, and he's said that they need to basically start treating them as such. And it's like Kamala Harris is not going to do any of that. She's not going to stand up to any of these client states and tell them to roll back whatever their war crimes. But we'll talk about escalations now with Russia and China. We've got we've got Russia. So now the U.S. is saying they're going to start launching cyber attacks against Russia over the SolarWinds attack, which they have still yet to prove that Russia had anything to do with. In fact, what's really interesting is SolarWinds, their CEO, this guy Kevin Thompson. He's blamed. They're going. Well, first of all, the whole reporting for the longest time now has been basically, you have people like David Sanger at the New York Times coming out and saying, there's not a lot of doubt from the people I've spoken to in the intelligence community that Russia did this. I mean, look at how sophisticated this operation was. Only a small minority of people could pull this off, and it had to be a state actor and this sort of thing. And you've got the CEO of SolarWinds coming out going, actually, an intern posted the password on GitHub years ago, and the password was SolarWinds123. So even this, the U.S. it's funny, how the NSA and the military have like basically said with the Bounty Gate canard, they're like, nah, we can't, we're not backing that up. We can, they won't even support it. The NSA, I think, said that they had low confidence, and that's basically a dead giveaway because the NSA is tapping the whole world. If they don't say that, if they say something is not true or that they can't prove it or that they have low confidence, then yeah, because they're not going to put their neck out like that. But what I found interesting was with SolarWinds, they said back in January, the FBI, the NSA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Department of National Intelligence released a statement where they say the hack was likely Russian in origin. And as Dave DeCamp says in this report here, missing from the statement was any evidence for the accusation. But on that basis, Biden is saying they're going to launch some cyber attacks. They just announced new sanctions against Russia over the whole situation with Alexei Navalny last week. And they say what's interesting is this was all announced in a report at the New York Times. So you have anonymous officials saying the first major move is expected in the next 3 weeks, and it'll be a series of clandestine actions across Russian networks that are intended to be evident to President Putin and his intelligence services and military, but not to the wider world. So, I mean, I just found it interesting that that's even. Why would you announce that that's the plan? Like, it's just the whole thing is absolutely just absurd and hyper aggressive, but just like, okay, so now we know that you're launching a cyber attack against Russia. So the wider world is well aware then of this operation. Might not all know all the details, but like why it's just I don't know. It's just absolutely.
I mean, it could be
like,
to be more for the American public. That one of the things that I thought when I saw that it was announced was that this is in part for the American public to make it seem like we're doing something about Russia, because one of Biden's main points was Trump wasn't doing anything about Russia. Trump wasn't doing anything about Russia. But in reality, Trump had extremely aggressive anti-Russia policy, expanding NATO, refusing to, killing arms control agreements and refusing to sign extensions on others. Well, Biden comes in, and what does he do? I think put some sanctions on Russia, but Trump sanctioned Russia. That wasn't anything new. And he extended the New START treaty. Trump wasn't going to do that. And so to make it obvious that he's a tougher president on Russia, that was kind of my interpretation of why they put it out like this. Or else they were maybe hoping for an overreaction from Russia. I don't know what that would look like, but maybe hoping that Russia would further demonize themselves to kind of justify the anti-Russia stance in the U.S. Because again, this is definitely
it's all part
an
of this
official
America's back shtick.
Right.
It's all part of this sort of America's back shtick where like you're absolutely like the kind of the mainstream consensus is like, well, didn't Trump give away the store to Putin? So now we've got to, because I mean, if you're a loyal consumer of mainstream media, particularly like let's say MSNBC, and I don't know, I hope that demo is, or that their audience is dwindling. Although I will say, it turns out that a lot of these like CNN, for instance, their ratings were really tanking until Trump came in and he kind of gave them a whole second wind. So I think toward the end of the Obama administration, people were really kind of fed up with the propaganda. It was pretty obvious. And so their ratings were going down. I think people were looking at alternative media more. And then Trump came in and they launched the whole Russiagate psyop. And I think that really gave them a whole, you know, kind of a second life there. But now I think with Biden back in there, hopefully that'll change, because I think it's back to the sort of the similar thing where it's like you can't really just keep talking about Trump, but they're definitely going to continue on with this whole Russia hysteria. I think that's here to stay for sure. And we see Biden just flew B-1 Lancer bombers over the North and Baltic Sea on Wednesday. And we had one of the bombers do a low fly over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. You've got U.S. bombers joined by fighter jets from Denmark, Poland, Germany, and Italy. These are the B-1 bombers that, well, they've been stationed in Norway. Early on in his administrations, Biden, after the whole, so he gets back in, like you said, extended New START, and he immediately starts attacking. Even on that phone call with Putin, he's haranguing him about Ukraine's sovereignty and accusing them of the SolarWinds hack and the whole Bounty Gate conspiracy theory. And you had early on, even you had I think back even in December before he was in office, you had Biden appointees saying that, well, our response will include it'll be more than just sanctions, including, like, they were even hinting at the idea that they would launch cyber attacks against Russian, they were saying against like Russian infrastructure. And so this is really kind of the fruits of that policy that was probably being developed at the time. But we're seeing it's starting to look a lot more like what I'm seeing is after Trump, because during the whole COVID situation, when Trump started really ramping up these provocations, particularly of China, but also of Russia, just poking them militarily, particularly with the Navy and with warplanes, we have the U.S. has totally continued these policies, and really, it seems like the allies are now in on it more than ever. So, like, you've got Germany, I just mentioned, was involved in this bomber flight. You had, but they are also planning to sail a warship through the South China Sea soon. And you had the French put a nuclear sub in the South China Sea last month. And also last month, Russia intercepted French warplanes over the Black Sea. You had Russian Su-27 fighters intercept them, and they turned around. But I have a report from Jason Ditz where he says, but this was common with U.S. planes being intercepted over the Black Sea throughout last year. But this is different. This is it's really unique to have the French provoking Russia in this way. And so there's a report here from Dave Decamp from antiwar.com talking about how you have the Germans, like I said, sailing this warship to the South China Sea, and America came out and said, we want to thank Germany for their support for the rules-based international order. And you have the UK planning to sail an aircraft carrier, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, through the South China Sea soon. They announced that over the weekend. Yeah, it's just, this is all, as Dave points out, this is kind of dovetailing with that NATO report that was put out last year where they named China as a major threat to Europe for the first time. And we've seen reports about how the Biden administration is going to be working in particular with the Quad, with Australia, India, and Japan. And there were sources from the administration who told the Financial Times that the Quad will form the core of Biden's Asia policy. And yeah, we've just seen big escalations. There's the whole Pentagon reassessment of the East Asia policy. They're probably looking to increase assets there. And we're going to see a lot more of this. The Jake Sullivan is leading the whole charge with the National Security Council to, they're decreasing the amount of people they have covering the Middle East, and they're going to put in more people to work on, the Asia file. And actually, what's interesting too is with the solar winds thing, they may be looking for some sort of a new kind of version of that with China, because Microsoft is accusing China of having hacked their email server. And they're saying this affected all kinds of local governments, cities and towns, small businesses, and then they add in and military contractors. The U.S. has yet to attribute claim for this, or attribute blame to China for this, but they're saying they're planning. I believe they said that they're planning a response, though, which is interesting. You had Blinken come, and I'll just say with Microsoft, I noticed when I was looking at Center for New American Security, which is really, really hawkish. Almost, I mean, they're effectively neoconservative. They had Victoria Nuland as their CEO, and I believe their CEO right now is a former McCain aide. But they're founded by Michelle Flournoy. Anyway, Microsoft donates between $100,000 and $250,000 to them, along with Facebook and Google and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman. And you can go and look at the list. They're funded by, there you see the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office. They're funded by the Japanese Embassy, Lockheed. They've taken a huge, CNAS is full of hawks, anti-China hawks. So it's very interesting to me just that Microsoft is the one making these claims. Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of people in Biden's administration from CNAS who are very hawkish. Like you've got Eli Ratner, who's the advisor to Lloyd Austin, sort of keeping him in line because a lot of people were concerned that Austin wasn't going to be sufficiently hawkish enough on China. So he's there. He's calling for the combat credible posture in the Indo-Pacific. You've got Kurt Campbell, who's a former CEO at CNAS, he's been called an architect of the Asia pivot. He's the coordinator of Indo-Pacific affairs for the National Security Council. He recently wrote a piece at Foreign Affairs that he co-authored where all these different think tankers have their little weapons wish lists. We've got the head of Indo-Pacific Command demanding, I think it's like $27 billion now, and they want a multi-billion-dollar missile system to they want to basically have missiles all throughout that first island chain in the South China Sea. But you've got Kurt Campbell at the National Security Council. He says we need to invest in long-range conventional cruise and ballistic missiles, unmanned carrier-based strike aircraft, underwater vehicles, guided missile submarines, high-speed strike weapons, and also Avril Haines, who is the director of national intelligence, who is got her own anti-China bona fides, is from the CNAS board of directors as well. And yeah, we're definitely ramping up the new Cold War with Russia and China on both fronts, militarily, diplomatically, I guess now with in the cyber sphere. So it's really interesting how they've got the whole Trump agenda just with America's back.
Right.
It's very different in meaningless ways.
Right. The propaganda I've talked about is so thick on that. But Connor, thanks for coming back on the show and sharing all the bad news. Tell people where to find your work, where to follow you on social media.
Yeah, please. My articles go up at the Libertarian Institute. I should have some more coming up soon. And follow me on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right, Connor, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Kyle.